Everyone, this is update for April 26, 2023, day 427 of the war, and of the date update. This is also catch up for April 25. So, as always, I'm going to start with strategic general updates, and then we're going to switch to the battlefield in Ukraine. So yesterday I was discussing pretty bad situation in Europe where most of the population is unwilling to defend the political regimes under which they live. Especially, I was pointing out to Western Europe and the most concerning countries were, I think, Netherlands, Germany, and a bunch of others, Italy, I think, and so I actually saw some information on. So I said at that time that it would be interesting to see what's going on in the U.S. So if in case of Europe, people are unwilling to defend their own countries, for the most, with exception, I would say, Northern Europe and some parts of Eastern Europe. But in case of the U.S., is actually different problem. It's unable, and in this case, there's research that shows that 77% of the U.S. population that's supposed to, supposed to serve in the army in case of war, and generally, that 77% of the population is unfit because of the problem with narcotics, alcohol, mental problems, or obesity. So, as you can imagine, with 23%, that's just totally, it's 4 out of 5 cannot serve in the army. There is actually, in other research, there's even more depressing numbers. There are estimates that show that only 6% of the US population are metabolically uncompromised. What this really means that only 6% of US population has sort of normal or healthy in a sort of full meaning of the word of this term, and the rest is have some degree of problems with health, which again, health is what you need during the war, and that is what you expand, because war really destroys health pretty quick due to the harsh conditions, due to the food that all of this food that sort of preserved food that giving to the soldiers, it really destroys your health pretty quickly. So you really need to be in good health, or you're not going to be able to survive for long. To be fair, a lot of Ukrainian and Russian soldiers, they actually cook healthy food, but I don't know to what extent that's sort of viable, and I don't think it's sort of people in the West are used to actually cook sort of for themselves, and specifically healthy food and so on. Anyway, so the summary is the following: is population in Europe is unwilling, and in the US is unable to defend their own countries. So the only reason, and this is obviously known to let's say Russia and China, they all do this kind of research. They understand what's going on. The only thing that stops from outright hot war is actually nuclear weapons that West has. That's a real deterrent for China and Russia. At the same time, China is working hard on increasing its arsenal of nuclear warheads. U.S. has actually restarted its production of nuclear warheads as well. I think they plan to produce 80 this year. So as you can see, this armament race is back. in vengeance, what you used to be in 80s and before in 70s and so on during Cold War. It's everything. All of that is back and really on steroids. Also, want to mention another problem that's going on. This is more relevant to Ukraine. Ukraine was promised 1 million artillery shells in 2023 from Europe. And there is a big problem there because there is a fight within sort of European Union where France really has uncompromising position where they want everything to be produced in Europe from EU, and they don't want any components outside of coming outside of EU. In, for example, even the gunpowder, which would be sourced from South Korea, they're not willing to compromise on that. Because of that, this whole purchase program is essentially stuck. Europe was able to only purchase 40,000, procure internally, and this looks like a stalemate. And obviously, this is the worst moment to have that, as you can imagine. If Ukraine is to go into this offensive, it definitely needs a lot of artillery shells. And let's switch to a little bit. Another topic is Turkey. It looks like Turkish president has had a heart attack, which means he may not last long. Indefinitely will not be able to be sort of politically active. This is extremely important because Turkish president is kind of like a cornerstone for the whole region in many ways, and sort of supported the status quo in terms of Ukrainian sort of expert and grain expert, and was sort of kind of like a bridge between Russia and the West. And if he is gone, this may lead to sort of tectonic shift and sort of uncontrollable development of the situation. We'll see what happens, and there is another sort of potential for the crisis is re-election in Turkey, which is going to be on May 14, and it does look like he's not going to win those re-elections. So that's again, there is another source of huge uncertainty in the region on top of what's going on, because Turkey is also supplying or selling, to be fair, a lot of military equipment to Ukraine, and at the same time, as I said, it was a large buyer and basically reseller of Ukrainian agricultural commodities. This whole can collapse. And it would be, I would say, significant blow for Ukraine if this status quo goes away. However, this grain deal at this point it's blocked by Russia, and Russia is very clearly is unwilling to extend it. However, it looks that there will be changes. Looks like U.S. agreed to open up SWIFT for one Russian bank, specifically for this agricultural trade. It's a Bank, or Rossельхоз Bank. So that bank will be allowed to have a SWIFT, and it will be able to accept payments for export of Russian grain and Russian fertilizers. So it looks like Russia finally managed to achieve what they want out of this grain deal, which means that they will be able to sell grain and fertilizer to the world market, similar to how to what Ukraine is doing. And so that would be, even though obviously it helps Russia, but for Ukraine, it's essentially the last source of oxygen for Ukrainian economy, because at this point the rest of the economy is doesn't work, stopped, and agriculture was last remaining engine of Ukrainian economy that's sort of let's say, sustaining and profitable. And it got to the point that agriculture is about 2/3 of Ukrainian economy at this point, which is obviously not right, not normal, but the collapse of the rest of the economy leads to the fact that agriculture is the most resilient out of the other sectors of the economy, and it still produces some profit. At the same time, as I mentioned before, European Union and Eastern European countries blocked Ukrainian export of agricultural commodities, which I would say is reasonable and understandable. There's no question. The market for Ukraine is really not Europe. It's really Asia and in Africa. So that's where the traditional markets are, and so the only realistic and profitable output for Ukrainian grain and for Ukrainian agricultural commodities is through Black Sea ports. So that's why this grain deal is so vital and important. And just for the reference, China is one of the Ukraine, I think, is in top 5 suppliers of agricultural commodities to China. I think it just in Q1 of this year, China purchased at least 1 billion worth of agricultural commodities from Ukraine. Even as you can imagine, this grain deal is barely working, but China is actively buying agricultural commodities on the world market. Let's switch actually now to China and Ukraine. So Ukrainian president called Chinese president. They spoke. They claimed that there was great conversation. It lasted almost 1 hour and so on. In my opinion, it will lead to nothing because what China sort of proposes is absolutely unrealistic, and China, I think, knows that as well. They just paint the picture on the international scene just to show that they are sort of peacemaker, not troublemaker, but it's just I would say cynical, and that's not really what they're trying to achieve. So I don't think there won't be much out of this this phone call. And because there is not really middle ground. Ukraine wants its territories back, and Russia obviously doesn't want to cede anything, whatever they captured. So the only solution is military force, and even the ceasefire will not lead to anything. The example is actually the past, is the ceasefire that was since 2015, after the hot phase of the war in 2014 and 2015. And as you can see, this really led to actually even bigger conflicts. So again, the ceasefire, all it will do is just will create basis for even larger conflict in couple, whatever, I don't know, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 years. As soon as Russia is feeling that it's ready, it's refreshed, and it's sort of ready to deal the final blow to Ukraine. And the problem was that at that time Ukraine is going to be way too weak because of the territorial losses and economic losses, that it will probably fold pretty quickly at that point. Now let's since we were talking about China, there's another country that's switching from US dollar to Chinese yuan in a trade with obviously China. It's Argentina. And that makes a lot of sense because Argentina is buying a lot of commodities from China, sort of ready goods, and then they're exporting a lot of agricultural commodities to China. So there is natural economic benefit, and there's no need to use intermediary, especially if China wants to sort of make it independent and uninterruptible trade in case of conflict with the U.S. They definitely need this direct use of the Chinese currency. At the same time, as I said before, it does not mean switch to Chinese yuan as global reserve currency, because as I said, the key here for to determine who's going to be world reserve currency is which currency is being used as the with the function of saving or in other words accumulating capital, and it's definitely not Chinese yuan. No, because that's a question of trust, and nobody would trust communist regime that sort of can expropriate all of your capital with one move, keystroke on the computer. So Chinese yuan will never be global reserve currency, but it may become the means of payment for the countries that have large trade flow with China, which is essentially most of the world. And so, and the reason for that is very natural, because China is the factory of the world, so it produces what the rest of the world needs, and the rest of the world supplies raw materials for this factory and some other intermediate also goods. So there is sort of natural logic in all of this, because in a way, to great extent, for example, US, it doesn't really produce much that's needed by the rest of the world, with few exceptions such as airplanes, probably some semiconductors, but largely there is not much in the US. So for that reason, there is not, it's not going to be, means of payment US dollar, but at the same time, US still providing relative security and safety. So for that reason, it will maintain status as a reserve currency because it will be the tool to accumulate capital. Similar situation in Europe. Well, actually, better situation in Europe, because Europe produces quite a bit of high-tech products for the world. I would say plus cars and so on. So there is much more need for euro. As just demand for goods made in Europe, it's still there. It's definitely better situation than in the US. However, there is a problem in Europe in terms of euro being a tool for accumulation of capital. So for that reason, it cannot really compete with US dollar. So again, it all gravitates towards US dollar. And the only way dollar is going to lose its status as a reserve currency is through actions within the US. If the inflation is out of control, the spending is out of control in US, that's the only way to destroy the status of US dollar. And the shift is actually not going to be to yuan, as many people claim, but it's actually probably going to be to gold. And actually from that perspective, none of the existing political regimes in the world want that. So China doesn't want it, Russia doesn't want it, US doesn't want it, Europe doesn't want it, Japan doesn't want it. Nobody wants that, because that really removes ability of the governments for abuse through inflation. And that abuse is essential for many governments, so they will not cede that control ever. So they will fight tooth and nail to keep that. So we'll see what happens there. Let's actually, I have another little bit of update on the situation in Russia and economic situation in Russia, and mention it's very bad. And there's another factual information. So Russia has 16 cities that are large cities that are basically 1 million or large in population. And in case of Moscow, I think Moscow is about 12 million people, and St. Petersburg, I think between 6 to 8. There are many others that that doesn't mean that they are 1 million. It's million and more. So real estate, and I mentioned this before in terms of apartments. So there is more than, if we look at this segment of this more than 1 million population cities, more than 50% of newly built apartments are not sold in those cities, which is, as you can imagine, is pretty bad situation. And I would like to. There's a couple that I would like to mention that where situation is, I would say, totally disastrous. One is Krasnodar, that where it's 83% of the apartments is unsold. Another one is Omsk, where it's 80%. So and very interesting because Krasnodar is really, let's say, nicer place in Russia where people try to move because it's climate-wise, it's a good place. So it was fast developing city, so it was very popular to move to among Russians. So it actually kind of tells quite a bit that this sort of whole engine of people they moving to sort of more mobile, and that there are no opportunities essentially. That in a way, kind of like inside of Russia, there is like the natural processes, economic processes, essentially frozen, even at the demographic level. So, as I said, all of that GDP picture that's being painted by Russian Statistical Bureau is absolutely misleading, and economic situation in Russia is absolutely disastrous. Now let's switch to the situation in Ukraine, and specifically on the battlefield in Ukraine. So I want to first speak a little bit about the situation with Wagner mercenaries. So the manager of Wagner mercenaries, Evgeny Prigozhin, was speaking recently, and he again confirmed the existing problems, that they're not really getting enough shells, so they're getting really bare minimum. And the reason, as I said before, there's not enough production of shells in Russia, and whatever is being produced is being actually stockpiled to fend off this expected Ukrainian offensive. So they stockpile so that they can defend during that offensive. And then the other source of the problem for Wagner mercenaries is there's no people. There's no inflow of people, not even close to what they used to have. So essentially, they are slowly, melting ice cube, and they melted pretty far away. So there is really they shed over themselves. And his estimates, they will last 2 to 3 weeks, and then essentially they will disappear. So that's the situation, and that what this really means, it's actually unclear at this point if they will manage to gain full control of Bahmut. At the same time, and he points it very correctly, the whole point was not about capturing Bahmut by itself as geographic point. The point was inflicting losses on the Ukrainian side, as heavy losses as possible in terms of people. And from that perspective, Wagner mercenaries were successful. They also suffered losses to the extent that they ceased to exist. But it's as planned. It was exchange of what is considered by Russian leadership is of lower quality people for better quality people, right? So that's exchange of these prisoners for sort of better, high quality, trained Ukrainian soldiers, which essentially blunts Ukrainian ability to for the offensive. I don't think it really, the losses are not that sort of not to the point that the offensive is not going to happen, but it certainly definitely created a pretty big dent in Ukrainian military. And as a whole, I just want to mention that as the war progresses, the quality of sort of human material of the soldiers goes down. It will never get back. It will, you sort of basically, when you start the war, it's like you are in best shape, and from there it's all downhill for both parties, for both sides. So you know this is sort of normal progression of every war. It's not just this war. Every single war goes the same path. That in a way it's unfortunate that it takes away the best, and this is what's been happening to Ukrainian army, and this is what's been happening to the Russian army as a whole. I'm not talking about Wagner mercenaries. And at the same time, even though those people were prisoners, to be fair, they were fighting pretty well, and so from a perspective of a military, they may not be the worst sort of people, and from societal perspective, they may be worse, even though it's the judicial system in both in Ukraine and Russia are not not to be trusted. So who knows if what percentage out of those people were truly bad and which percentage were just sort of assigned to be bad by the judicial system there. So as I said, the expectation even by the Russian side that in 2-3 weeks the Wagner mercenaries are going to be basically completely annihilated. Doesn't mean that the organization is going to be annihilated. I just want to explain the way it functions. It has sort of like a backbone of commanders. So that backbone will continue to exist and will be sort of pulled back to the rear and refitted with sort of new, call it new muscles, right? But the amount of those muscles will be much smaller relative to where Wagner mercenaries were, let's say in the fall of 2022. And this is sort of part of the business plan for the leadership of Wagner mercenaries. So that's how the organization is evolving. So this is not sort of a disaster. It's sort of planned where it's going to go. Then the other point that the head of Wagner mercenaries made is that they expect Ukrainian offensive probably starting somewhere after May, let's say May 9, 10, somewhere in that ballpark, because it's still, the conditions on the ground is still pretty bad, and will remain pretty bad for at least another week. So, and then you really need time to dry up. It's not going to happen overnight. You also need another at least a week for that. So this gives us at least 2 weeks, and more likely it's going to be at least 3 weeks. This is just from a weather perspective. From a perspective of the equipment, Ukraine needs more time, and especially shells. I mentioned these problems within the European Union, where there is not really movement to supply enough shells to Ukraine. So This all delays this highly expected offensive. Now let's actually switch to the front line. We're gonna do in a clockwise fashion, as I always do. So the situation along the state border remains more or less the same. Just exchange of artillery fire, all sorts of attacks. And, there is definitely not a quiet time. Let's put this way. Then let's jump to the North Lugansk front line. Things here are remain quiet, similar to the Zaporizhya front line, as I mentioned before. Both sides are sort of preparing for the offensive and counter-offensive that will follow that offensive. So at this point, and both sides don't have enough shells. So at this point, it's fairly I would say quiet, but doesn't mean that there's no fighting or anything. It just skirmishes essentially at this point here. Then let's move to North Donbass. Again, here Russian attacks, Wagner mercenaries attacking, but really without much success at this point. So as I said, the front line goes where I show roughly. And it kind of remains there more or less. There is not really essential progress over past couple days by Wagner mercenaries. This is just a quick reminder how everything kind of progressed. The only difference is that there are also attacks here in Orikhovo-Vasilievka, but this is being done by the Russian airborne units. Still don't know the number of the units that are operating here. But in any case, there is really pretty much no progress at all here at this point, which again highlights the point that Wagner mercenaries are sort of, let's say, largely close to be completely depleted or expanded, and the abilities to continue offensive is extremely limited. At the same time, the only reason why they still can do something because Ukrainian side is extremely exhausted as well. So it's not that the weakness on Ukrainian side is obviously there as well, and there are huge losses, and it all sort of drains people, and especially from the sort of moral perspective. Then let's move down south to central Donbass front line. Things here are, essentially without change. Again, all three typical places of attacks without essentially any progress there as well. So it's essentially stalemate, and more of sort of painting the picture by the Russian militaries and really trying to achieve anything. And then this is just a quick update on Avdiivka, which essentially there's no update. Situation remains the same. And then Zaporizhya front lines, things are sort of stable, no news, no updates. As I said before, this is most likely section where there's going to be offensive, but at this point it's all quiet on the Western Front there. Thanks for watching, and till next time. Bye bye.